absolute pleasure to be here. One of my most favorite people, Rosabeth Moss-Cantor, who was the editor for the HBR for a long time, said that the most radical thing we can do is to introduce people to one another. New connections and conversations spark innovation and transformation. So I think, whatever else comes out of this, I think big thank you to ISDM, Ravi and his team to at least get this conversation going. The context, Ms. Swaroop said many things that resonated, and I think they will push you to think harder about the way we view many of these issues in our teams, in our organizations, and the system around us. But the context is that the social sector does have a better representation of gender overall. However, only 18% of large nonprofits have women CEOs. And as you go up the hierarchy, the same global issues surface. Like in other parts of the economy, far fewer women in leadership positions than men, and discrepancies in terms of pay and growth opportunities. Women-led causes are inadequately funded, and globally only 1% of gender equality funding goes to women-led organizations. Now, social enterprises were set up to enable fairer economies. And I think this conversation is critical because even this sector continues to reflect what we see in other segments of the ecosystem. Why must this change? And how can we facilitate this change? To answer these questions, I'm, like Priyanka, delighted with our star panelists. And I'm hoping that we will get lots of food for thought and pointers for action. I'm going to start with Vedika. Vedika, given that you have traversed the conventional corporate sector for a large part of your career, and now the social sector, how would you compare your experience across these two with respect to diversity in general, and specifically with respect to as you go up the hierarchy in these organizations?
Sure. Hi, Anuradha. Hello, everyone. And it's really good to be here. So I guess my headline message is that it's work in progress across both sectors. Diversity is still work in progress across both the corporate world as well as the social sector. I think if you look at the social sector and you start with the positives, in general, as you rightly said, Anuradha, there's much better gender diversity across the organization, right? If I look at my own organization where I work, I know out of a total of 130, I think we are 70 or maybe even more women and less men. And that's true when I don't know if it's more women than men, but in general, gender diversity is much better in social sector. But you are right. And again, not to toot our horn, but we have a similar ratio right at the senior leadership. I think of our senior leadership executive team of 7, we have 4 women and 3 men. So yay, we're doing something right. But the numbers do fall in terms of senior leaders across social organizations. But I would like to not just about gender diversity, but also about ethnic and racial diversity. And this is especially true when we look at nonprofits, which their work span across multiple countries. So do we really have the voices, the people who we are serving, those voices or from those communities at the senior most table? I think it's still very much a work in progress. When I look at the corporate sector, they are in some parts of the corporate sector, they are much further behind. So yes, sectors like technology, sectors like finance, retail, services, they have a much better gender representation. But manufacturing or much more traditional industry, they just don't have good gender representation right from the entry level. But all of them across all the sectors in the corporate level, the diversity tends to fall off even more starkly than it does in the social sector. So as I said, it's work in progress across both. I think the last comment I would make is the good news is both of these, both the social and the corporate sector, are very aware of it now, are very focused on it. The conversations are happening. Some of them are very uncomfortable conversations. For example, in the United States, there's a lot of conversation about race. And, none of these conversations are pleasant, or it's hard to look critically at yourself. But I feel really hopeful and optimistic that these conversations are happening, and these will result to better things. Thanks, Anuradha.
Thank you. Can I just ask you a very quick follow-on question? Given that you have risen to the top in both sectors, is there one or two things that you can share with us that you think have made that possible for you?
First of all, I wouldn't say risen to the top, but I've been very lucky to have worked with great teams and great organizations. So I think that that's the first part. None of this, either in the corporate world or in the social world, it's an individual sport. It's always a team sport. So you have to be working with great teams. You have to be surrounded by incredible colleagues. You have to work with incredible leaders. So I've been lucky in both those cases. So I think that would be the first one. There is the other one I would say is good old-fashioned hard work, maybe. And you caught me a little off guard, Anuradha, so I'll think a little bit more about it.
Come back if something else strikes you. But I have to say that your first answer is just so much. I'm not saying female, I'm just saying feminine. The first answer is just so representative of the feminine in leadership. But thank you. Neera, if I could come to you next. You work across social sector organizations. You really do have 30,000 feet and then a very micro view of organizations that you watch and work with. What are some of your observations around diversity on boards? Also some trends in the sector? And do you have observations in terms of size, longevity, very importantly, the nature of donors in the organizations that you look at and their impact on what you observe in terms of diversity on boards?
So you asked me a very loaded question, Anuradha, for which I have to admit, please cut me off if I go over time, but I have to admit everything I'm sharing is awfully anecdotal because we don't actually have enough of a strong research base around understanding nonprofit boards. And therefore our tendency resides a lot in our country to look to the US and see the US journey on boards. And I just would like to urge us to transcend that experience. And I think there's a lot that we can do in India to just accelerate diversity on boards. With that, I think we've made a lot of progress, although there continue to be a lot of challenges. I think like any organization, when you start off kind of as a founder, and I can speak for myself and it'll hopefully resonate with other founders, you start off with family and friends, right? You don't want to take a big risk. People don't want to take a big risk. They're not sure your organization's going to succeed, and you frankly don't have the time to deal with a board that starts asking a lot of questions when you're like in a survival kind of mode. So I actually think that works in the very beginning. What we've also seen is it's about at the 10-year mark where an organization actually starts to have some stability, your team is a bit larger, your funding's a bit stable. That's when you start thinking about, okay, this has grown, I can probably speak for myself, this has grown beyond my capabilities. Now actually having a board can support me in some of the decision making, but can also be there and watch out for things around governance and compliance. And that's really where you see the shift of founders being able to move or starting to move family and friends. But I have to admit, as a sector. I think we do it far later. And some of that comes from the challenge when you move from family and friends to sort of professionals or sector experts. You need process and system in the organization to be able to communicate and engage with the board, and then also be very clear on, so what kind of decisions is this board actually making? I think the other challenge in our country is the regulatory environment. And so you're seeing a lot of hesitance for individuals to want to enter into boards with the liability and the legal aspect. But there's nothing to take away from the fact that you can have a legal board, but you can also create an advisory board that merges together and is still involved in the governance or strategy or direction setting. So we're starting to see a lot of nonprofits take that kind of hybrid mode in some ways. So that's a little bit of kind of what we've been seeing. I thought it might be useful for us to speak about gender very specifically. But before I get to gender, I couldn't agree with Vedika more that diversity on the board has to move beyond gender. And that's really where, as a country, if we can crack gender, we can actually simultaneously crack community representation. And so how do you do both of them in, a parallel way? I think we should really accelerate as a country. But specifically with gender, I think what ends up happening with us is a lot of us women opt out. And what I'm very excited about the training program is that it creates a platform and a pathway for women. This training program that we're looking to launch to really encourage more women professionals onto boards is that it creates a pathway for women and then placing them there. But the challenge isn't just the training to some extent or us being able to place. The challenge is also, is there a sharing of power? So I think what ends up happening is you can bring diversity to the board, but if the chairperson and other established folks don't create the space and open up space and share that power, then the diversity actually doesn't really matter. So sharing power with men leaning in. So I know Vedika was like, oh, it was good luck and I was really lucky. I think it's because there's a lot of men in powerful positions who look out for you, right? Or promote this. And so how do you make them partners in this journey? And how are we creating that space on boards, I think is really important, especially as a chairperson. So chair people often will be the ones running the agendas of these boards. They need to be completely brought in that voice is being enabled in some way. So, Ms. Swaroop was talking about voice. That actually needs to be enabled by the sentiment of what is kind of around the table. So these were a couple of things that I thought I would highlight. I think the last thing around gender on boards is we have to, as a country, be more than one independent director on the corporate side. And so as a nonprofit sector, we should really push. I mean, I said don't look at US research, but I did look at US research. And there's something to be said of the number 3. If you can bring 3 women onto the board, you will find that their feminine attributes. So that's the other thing that I think is worth clarifying. It's not personal attributes, I think, as Ms. Swaroop might have said. It's feminine attributes that need to come onto the board. I went to Harvard Business School. I spent a number of years in investment banking and I studied math. And I have a tremendous amount of masculine attributes that were learned over time. So what has also happened on corporate boards is you bring women onto corporate boards and they're all behaving in this with masculine attributes. What we need to do is encourage us to bring out the feminine attributes that can encourage that kind of diversity is sort of my whole point around sharing power, but also us as women recognizing that actually has a place. And we don't realize that some of that environment actually shapes the way that we behave. So I see you unmuted, so I'll pause here.
No, please, wrap. It wasn't meant to cut you short. I was just getting ready to ask the next question. Please go ahead.
I just wanted to give one last anecdote really around, why I'm a big believer in the training. And I know that Ravi, Aarti, and I had a lot of debate, like, should it just be for women and why just women? It should be for everyone because, men have to be partners in this. But I do realize that there's something to be said of bringing us together as women and recognizing what we need to be supported in the kinds of environments or the bias and the assumptions that are in these spaces, right? Or the way that these spaces behave. And I know from personal experience, for example, at Harvard Business School, where 60% of your grade is participation, you have to put your hand up in class. And we were about at 25%, maybe 27% in my class of women who didn't put your hand up. Now, what they ended up doing after I graduated was recognize the challenge we were facing. It brought women together and said, hello, first 15 minutes, put your hand up. Doesn't matter what you say. And it actually goes to Vedika's point. We all come with wanting to, succeed with knowledge. And sometimes it's just, put your hand up and say something. And what will come out will be actually quite smart, and it'll be relevant, and you'll overcome this kind of syndrome that we suffer with. But yes.
No, it's fascinating. I mean, I run a program for young women, equipping them to get into the workplace with attributes that they otherwise, just haven't built. And confidence and courage is one of them. Just the confidence to raise your hand. And you're right, once you raise your hand, you're unlikely to say something stupid, but it's just, I think, generations of not being the troublemaker or sort of being loud and assertive. And I'm familiar with all the research that happened at Harvard between women in the class. And I mean, it's fascinating, and it's a conversation for another time. But I did want to say one little thing about the amplification of voices. There was a very interesting experiment that Barack Obama's White House did with women, and they say that when women make a point, it goes unnoticed, and then a senior man at the table makes the same point, and then there's a whole bunch of
mansplaining.
Yeah, and oh my God, that was a great point. And I mean, I noticed that even in meetings and things that I'm at. But in Obama's White House, the women decided that if there was a point that a man made that a woman had made earlier, some other woman would say, "Oh, like Carla pointed out some time ago." Right. So I think we have to just become more conscious about these things that exist in the environment. And not only is it a place for that voice, but how can you amplify that voice to have power? Like you said, Neera. Shiv, that's a great segue, by the way, into the theory of diversity, why it is important. And, I know that you're a big believer in the intersectionality of stuff. And I think that's been alluded to both by Vedika and Neera. So tell us why this is important. But I also want you to talk a little bit about what organizations and society at large stand to gain, but equally importantly, lose out when they don't take advantage or pursue diversity at every level in their organizations and in the things that you do. You're on mute, Shiv.
Sorry,
You've gone back on mute. You've gone back on mute.
Okay, hi, sorry. I'm really nervous about talking after, and that's what I was beginning to say, after Vrinda, after Vedika, after Neera, after Anuradha, and I cannot even say that whatever they've said is good or bad. I should just keep quiet. No, I'm just joking. So listen, so thank you so much. Let me start by saying that diversity is extremely important, but we have to connect it with two other terms that are equally important. We sometimes use diversity as a surrogate to capture many dimensions of what we have been speaking about: diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I think once you look at diversity, then of course it's a matter of representation. And I think we have a long way to go. I mean, imagine the United States and Canada, after all these years of progressive thinking in the international, in the philanthropic sector, in the NGO sector, they're still very much in the beginning stages. So we're talking in India of even greater complexity in terms of getting adequate representation of caste, gender. Again, we have to be very careful. It's not just men and women. It's the space of gender and sexual identity is much broader. We haven't even started talking about that. There is religion, extraordinarily important. There is language. There is economic status. There is disability of various kinds. So it's a challenge. It's really a challenge. So very important at step one for the organization to embed this or ingrain this in their value system. The second one is, even when you come to the boards, I think Vrinda was referring to it, this kind of, you have one person there, two person there, you've ticked the mark on diversity. That's a good starting point. That's a good starting point. The Panchayat Raj system started like that with 1/3 representation. That's a good starting point. But the organization has to really ensure equity, which means guarantee fair treatment. So how do you really, in the board, create a culture where women find themselves having access, equal opportunity to participate and express their views and so on. So I think creating an atmosphere of equity is important. And the third one is, of course, inclusion. How do you make it an organization where people of different diverse backgrounds find themselves comfortable enough, welcomed, respected, supported, and valued. So I still find that in Indian organizations, yes, you might have women, but it is largely male dominated. There's a parallel conversation that goes on behind the board and after the board meetings and so on, where women seldom come together to participate in those conversations. So I think we have to really consciously make this, emphasize diversity, equity, and inclusion. What are the benefits of an organization adopting these three values? Of course, there is extending the outreach. I think a diverse team will bring about, added with equitable practices, inclusive messaging, like was mentioned, the positioning of the organization becomes much more significant. You can broaden your reach and increase the chances of success, assuming that most of these organizations are trying to reach as non-profits, as many people from different communities as possible. It makes it a much healthier workplace, especially if you create an environment where you feel you're heard, you're understood, you're appreciated. This level of comfort definitely strengthens teamwork, and I think you'll have less conflict, higher productivity in a much narrower sense. And I think we also forget that when you open it up consciously for diversity, you get more qualified staff as well. So we don't look at all, because what this does is that you widen the pool of applicants very consciously, and then this diversity gets reflected in the contribution of people to your own organization and goals. So I think that's the benefits. What do we know? I think we know that, like was mentioned, it's a long journey. We have just started. Even in the United States, most of the research, I was just reading up in 2018, a study of the nonprofit boards, they said only 4.2% of the surveyed board members identified themselves as Hispanic, when the US population, nearly 18% of the total population at that time was Hispanic. So even just by going by numbers, we are in Canada in 2021, the study of 6,000 nonprofit boards said that only 8% were representative of the LGBTQ community, and only 6% had a disability, when the actual representation might be much more. So, but we have to begin somewhere, and I think that's where we have to push for. The fourth point, and the last one I'll make, is that we have to go beyond looking at representation and talk about impact. All right. So that's what we have been asking, and I think that's what Vrinda was saying. How do we make a difference? How, not just in terms of the whole functioning of the board and accelerating the organization's move towards its own mission and goals and reaching its goals and also. And then this Canada survey of these organizations in 2021 showed that only 30% had a written board diversity policy. So even to have a written policy on diversity, inclusion, and equity is extraordinarily important. And I think that makes it a difference. And if you put it on your website, it's so much more important to publicize and get a momentum going. In terms of the impact, I was very impressive finding that it says that boards with higher percentages of women tend to have more board member engagement. That is one of there are three criteria on making an impact: more board member engagement, higher fundraising engagement, and higher advocacy engagement. So I think there is some merit in saying that, yes, if you have more board members, there will be a representational of different diversities in this group, in the community that we are addressing, it will make a positive difference. And I think there's no doubt at all about that. Now, social science research tells you what is the minimum cutoff. I think Neera mentioned the number 3. It's really 30%. And when even the panchayat, should it be 25% women in panchayats, 40%, 50%? Somehow 1/3 seems to be the magic number. And I think in terms of influencing the other 2/3, I think if this 1/3 starts acting in a particular way, it has a much more dominating impact on the other 2/3. So I would still go with that. If you can borrow research findings from social sciences and bring it into the boards, I would really push for at least 1/3 representation. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Shiv. I think you answered one of my questions, which was, do numbers matter, and what would you take as a measure of diversity? So I think if we can work with the 1/3 as the aspiration, I think that's a good thing to work with. I do want to come back to, something that Ms. Swaroop started to talk about, which was optics matter. And in some ways, it's like saying, even if it's tokenism, it's important to get started. There is conversation around the downside of tokenism, which is that it can allow many people to stop the journey there, right? Tokenism is the start, and then how do you ensure that there is progress? So I just like all of you to talk to us a little bit about what to make sure and what to watch for, so that the tokenism doesn't become the hindrance or the obstacle in the path to better diversity and impact. Because it allows you to say, you are diverse already. So maybe we start with Vedika.
Sure. So, and before I answer your question, I just wanted to go back to something which Neera said, right? And both of you talked about, which is raising your hand. And this is something I often tell young women, all women, and my message always is, what's the worst that can happen, right, if you raise your hand? And that's often in the context of women telling me that they are hesitant to ask for the promotion, or they're hesitant to put their hand up for an opportunity. And I always tell them, well, what's the worst that can happen? The worst that can happen is your supervisor is going to say no. That's it. It's not fatal. The only thing which will happen is your ego might be hurt a little, but once you start thinking that way, that what's the worst that can happen? What's the worst that can happen in a class if you say something silly? People will laugh. That's okay. You move on, right? Hell, everybody says something silly at some point in time. So I just wanted to leave that out there. You asked about tokenism, and I really don't see it as tokenism anymore. Maybe when I was younger, I would have seen it as tokenism. I see it now as a nudge. And I feel like that nudge is really needed. So if you'd asked me when I was in my 20s, that should there be a law which says you have to have at least one independent woman director on the board, I would have said, no, women should come onto the board because they're good. Now, when I'm older and hopefully much wiser, I'll say, yes, bring it on. You brought one, maybe you go on to 2, because I think as a society, as we certainly need those nudges. Otherwise, I do hope my daughter will join the workplace in a few years' time. I don't think in her lifetime we will still be as diverse as we should be in the corporate and in the social sector. But I'm hoping by the time my granddaughter joins the workplace, this conversation is no longer needed. So I look at tokenism as a necessary nudge. But I think Shiv made a very important point, which is it can become a hindrance because diversity or having those tick marks, right, doesn't automatically lead to inclusion. And there is some deliberate action needed from ticking the boxes to actually reaping the benefits and having that inclusive workplace. And Neera talked about it in terms of sharing the power. I agree, the chairperson has an incredibly important role in that. But I think that can be a hindrance if we just stop at the tick boxes and don't do the harder work which is needed, which requires change of behavior, which requires sharing of power, which requires being aware of the mansplaining, which requires a lot of these behavioral changes. So I think that can be the hindrance, but I would say, and the last point I would make, and I think Ms. Swaroop also talked about it, and I see it all the time. Optics are important. Successful senior women, whether they like it or not, a lot of women are watching them and they get inspired by those. And I think we need many, many, many more such examples. Thanks, Anuradha.
Thanks, Vedika. Thanks. Neera, can I get you to respond to the same thing?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's a point in time, and it's the beginning of the journey. At least we've coined this term at Thusra called Jedi, not the Star Wars Jedi, but Jedi with a G, gender equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I think tokenism is the beginning. It's kind of like affirmative action. I'm a believer that it actually works, because with that initial tokenism, and if I do believe its meaning is mainly symbolic. So maybe in the beginning you are, or you're mandated, or you're doing it, to be symbolic. But that's the journey with which we have to start. But it'll take all of us to collectively, lean in and start to make a case for how it drives impact, at least in the social sector, or at least in the for-profit performance and results. Even in nonprofit, I think it's relevant. So as soon as it becomes an important part of how we are achieving our mission, I think that's really where it kicks off the sort of true Jedi journey. But in the meantime, if we are, being able to check the box, I do think that gets a lot of naysayers, right? It starts to break down our bias, our assumptions. It builds that pipeline. So there is benefit of the symbolic. I think there's even a larger benefit of making it, legal and part of law, but that's another conversation.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. There's a bunch of questions, and in the interest of time, I'm going to take some of those questions and we'll see who's best to answer it. So this says there's a dire need for diversity. Devika Menon says there's a dire need for diversity. Yes, but who are the stakeholders responsible for bringing this shift towards a more inclusive leadership in nonprofits? Do you feel that a more diverse or representative leadership will have a trickle-down effect in a given organization? I think some of you made the point about the chair of the board, but in addition to that, what could this be? I thought this was... Will one of you take it?
Neera? Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Shiv? Yeah, no, go ahead, Shiv.
No.
Go ahead.
I think it's a very important question, and how do we really move beyond numbers and targets for representation to create a change in the organization and the way the organization functions and behaves? And I think that's whose responsibility is that? And because targets and numbers have an instrumental significance, but we are talking about changing the organizational culture, and that really has to be driven by the top leadership of the board. So in addition to ensuring that the targets, I would say that the board leadership should ask 3 or 4 very critical questions. And I think that will drive the organization. So if you're in a board meeting and you have in your board agenda regular reporting on how well are you doing in this area, not just for information that, yes, we recruited 3 more people and we've got 4 more women in the group, but we are trying to ask how transparent does your organization, or is your organization, about the steps it is taking to become more diverse and encouraging of inclusive practices? So what are you doing about it? Does your non-profit create opportunities to listen to voices? And if you're dealing with communities, what are the mechanisms in place? You just can't say, yes, I'm respectful of the communities I serve. Where are the communities? Who are the voices? What mechanisms? Do you have any mechanisms in place to do this? Again, in your recruitment, it almost sometimes appears to me, we found we had 3 positions and we have recruited 2 as women. That doesn't please me at all. What efforts did you make starting from the beginning? Who are applying to your organization today? What is the representation of applicants you're getting? Is there a change? That would tell me that, yes, you are indeed making a significant effort to reach out. And finally, I think the most important is, how does your organization assess the progress that you're making towards your goals of diversity, inclusion, and equity? What will it look like 5 years from now, 10 years from now? And I think these are very difficult questions to answer, but there has to be the board and the senior leadership that prioritizes and drives these values beyond representation and numbers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I just add a quick point?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And it really upsets me when as a board member, when I ask this question, and in terms of even recruiting or promoting, and I'll be told, oh, but there isn't a pipeline, or we can't find the candidates. And I think I just feel that's a lazy answer.
Yeah.
And I think, one of the things which we should do is to push leaders to look at diversified slates, whether it's internal promotion or whether it's external hires. And it's a little more hard work. It's hard work to find the right networks. It's harder work for the recruiters. It's certainly harder work for the leaders. But if you keep pushing, then that becomes practice, right? And then it's, it becomes part of your DNA. But this is a very common answer. Oh, we would love to, but there's no pipeline.
Where are they? Yeah, absolutely.
You know, Anuradha, but I think the larger challenge is to ask ourselves, who's accountable to whom?
Yeah.
Right? So it's a nonprofit. See, I think in the for-profit sector, the corporate boards have somewhat figured it out, although there's challenges there. But in the nonprofit board, we're not clear about that level of accountability. So ultimately, success for JEDI work or this diversity work lies in leadership. Because most of the boards are rubber stamp boards, to be honest. It's like founders and leaders can probably do whatever they want at the end of the day. Our boards don't even fundraise like the US board. So what do most of the nonprofit boards, besides run their audit committees once in a while, actually do? Probably should be questioned. But then the larger question becomes, it works top down if the top is holding leadership accountable and you've built that kind of relationship to actually happen. Otherwise, it rests in all of us, frankly, as founders and leaders to start thinking about how this is staying accountable on mission, and it's going to allow us to achieve even more impact, but it's really based on a true set of values that this sector actually needs to be driven by. But we don't ask ourselves that accountability question enough.
Yeah, in fact, I thought I would ask, I don't think we'll have the time, but what are the 2-3 things that the not-for-profit sector can take as things to learn or to adapt from the for-profit sector? And some of these norms or reporting requirements could probably be one of those. I mean, Vedika alluded to that as well. There's an interesting question around, can you tell us what, from examples on how senior leadership decision-making would be different between men and women? And I'm going to just translate that into masculine and feminine traits. So any examples that you all can share to bring alive this value of the feminine on boards, or how it would be different?
Maybe
you're all smiling. Yeah, go ahead.
Maybe you should hear a masculine voice first. A daring young man. No. So let me tell you at some level, the kinds of people who make it to the boards have no reason to feel less privileged or intimidated in that sense. Okay, and just if I can tell you, I was the global co-chair of an global learning initiative called No Violence in Childhood. And this was a 5-year we brought out a global report. We were looking at violence against women and violence against children. And 99% of the professionals working in this space are women. And so when I was made the global co-chair, the other co-chair was Baroness Vivian Stern from the House of Lords. I said, hey, you guys have got this token man there now. And I fill three roles in one. I'm a 3-in-1. I'm a man, I'm an economist, Very few economists ever enter this space of looking at violence against women and violence. And I'm from deep south and the north south also. So you are very lucky and you're tick, tick, tick. But that was never the sense one got. That is never the sense one got because of the way everyone worked together and so on. I think that how do we really lead by intent and lead by action? And I think that is the key words are those, the leadership. And how do we really get things moving in the right spirit? You must have the tough conversation. You have to define the board priorities clearly. You have to start and be intentional, be bugging every time. You have to keep pushing. And we have to foster a culture of continuous learning. And because this is a journey and we have to constantly go at it, and that cultural change in the organization's culture has to be led by a very strong subcommittee or subgroup in the board that is dedicated to this idea of equity, inclusion, and diversity.
Neera, Vedika, any examples on how things would have been different if there was a man on the board versus woman, and I mean masculine versus feminine?
I was trying to say that men can be also as feminine as you were.
Absolutely, Shiv. That's the reason why I keep coming back to masculine and feminine traits as opposed to men and women. Yeah.
I think I would say over the last 2 years, with the pandemic and all the associated economic and social upheavals, organizational upheavals, not-for-profits, many of them had pretty significant funding issues. So, and I'm talking both of for-profit and non-profit boards. I think going through that, and I'm trying to think of what it would have been if it were only masculine or only feminine. And I really can't even fathom either, because I do think it needed the combination, and we are not out of it today. It needs the combination of both of those traits in terms of, because there were so many decisions which had to be taken, and some were incredibly tough, which had never been done in the organization's histories. And it really needed all of those to come together.
I don't think you could have given us a better example, Vedika. So thanks for that. I think we have literally 2 minutes left, and I'm going to wrap this up with a question for all of you. The thing that is most damaging to both men and women is stereotypes. If there is one stereotype that we wanted to fight or take out of our system for more women on boards and the diversity that would come with that, to just make it easier and facilitate the path for more women on boards, what is that one stereotype that you would like to fight or throw out of the window?
Anuradha, with 2 minutes to go, you're making all of us sit quietly and think. So maybe I should blurt out my answer first.
Please go ahead, Shiv.
Stereotypes can be negative, and that's the general impression. But stereotyping can also be extraordinarily positive in terms of the role models and images that you create. And I think the role of stereotyping is critical in this space, where we just project the extraordinary leadership qualities in women, and that it makes no difference. I think you go to Iceland and others, and you find more women leaders over there in parliament and in ministries. So there is, where was it? And I think some Latin American country also, there are more women leaders in the cabinet than men. I think we just have to keep pushing the positive stereotyping of women as exceptional leaders.
Very nice.
You don't have to necessarily run down men as being so.
Yeah. Neera, you're on mute.
Yeah, so I think that we've been talking about this a lot. I think the biggest stereotype is that all women come with feminine attributes. And so, breaking that down a lot more as to what helps us. And just to build on that earlier question, I actually think we do approach decision-making differently, right? I know you have only a few seconds, but we should look at that deeper and why, therefore, that's helpful. But the one tip I wanted to give, I know that's not the question you asked, is push for turnover on your boards. get people off your board to bring diversity.
Yeah.
I love Shiv's answer of positive stereotyping. So I love that. But I would say the one stereotype I hope we could get away from is saying women are emotional. Oh my God, I hate it. Yeah.
I'll start trying now.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I'm going to hand over back to Priyanka just in time.
Thanks, Anuradha.
Thank you, Anuradha.
Thank you, everyone.